Hi everyone, my name is Jimmy, and I created this video for my final project in 12th grade AP Literature. My task was to create an AP Lit style analysis of a video game, and I chose one of my all-time favorite games, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. The nature of a video game makes it a lot harder to convey a lot of the complexity that exists in written literature because you are always the actor in video games. Most literary works are set in stone. This character will always do this action or say this line on a specific page or at a specific time, no matter whether it's your first reading of the book or your 15th, or whether it's the professor's copy or the student's. Meanwhile, in video games, the game can try and ascribe certain levels of difficulty and importance to the different events that occur in the plot, but it's ultimately up to the player to figure out what matters to them. If you are like me, a 12-year-old playing Wind Waker for the first time, the final boss, Ganondorf, is a fearsome, difficult enemy that caps off hours of training, item collecting, and exploring, and puts all your skills to the test. But if you're a professional speedrunner playing the game for the 1000th time, the Ganondorf battle could be nothing but another routine you have to complete to get to the end credits as fast as possible, and the fight can be over in 30 seconds flat. With so much freedom to explore, develop, and grow on your own, everyone's playthrough of a video game, especially an RPG like Zelda, will be intensely personal. That's not to say that video games in general never have larger themes or meanings of a work as a whole, as we learned in literature. When it comes to thematic analysis, the more linearity, the better. So we have to work with what we have in Zelda games. The cutscenes, which will always be the same for all players. In the case of Zelda, where you have a main character whose only dialogue consists of grunts and yells, the cutscenes are the only way we ever find out more about Link and about the adventures he and his friends go on. Now that we've explained how we'll approach analyzing a video game from a literary perspective, let's provide the context and background that sets up the Wind Waker. While I know that one of the cardinal rules of responding to an AP Lit Q3 is never to re-summarize the plot, this analysis is both untimed, thankfully, and also I don't think the Wind Waker is exactly part of the literary canon. The game tells us about the backstory for the Kingdom of Hyrule's current state. After the Link from The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, who's known as the Hero of Time, was able to banish the great evil, Ganondorf, away, suddenly and unexpectedly, Ganondorf returned. But the Hero of Time did not, and as evil spread throughout Hyrule, the people prayed to their gods for a solution. In response, they flooded the entire kingdom, so that only the mountaintops remained as islands, and the previous kingdom of Hyrule was sealed underwater, frozen in time. Link, meanwhile, is a child celebrating his birthday when he gets dressed by his grandmother in the Hero of Time's clothing, as is customary for all boys on Outset Island when they turn 12. A giant angry bird called the Helmarock King immediately gives Link an awful birthday gift by kidnapping his sister, Errol. So Link joins a motley crew of pirates, led by the rambunctious Tetra, and befriends a talking boat called the King of Red Lions as they pursue the Helmarock King and his master, of course, Ganondorf. Link collects numerous tools, gadgets, and divine objects before returning to the now underwater Kingdom of Hyrule and activating the Master Sword. As Link races to collect one more all-powerful object, which is the Triforce, an icon of divine power that's in pretty much every Zelda game, Tetra is revealed to be the Princess Zelda, and the talking boat is to be the previous king of Hyrule. Together, they confront Ganondorf, and while Ganondorf wants to use the Triforce in order to bring Hyrule back, so he may lead it forever, the King of Hyrule touches it first, and wishes for Hyrule to be drowned, for good, once and for all. As Link kills Ganondorf by stabbing a sword into his head, and the water starts sweeping over Hyrule, Link and Zelda float to the surface, ready to leave Hyrule behind and begin life anew, in a kingdom of their own finding. Again, because the structure of video games doesn't really quite allow for that much nuance, the main theme of the Wind Waker is made pretty explicit. Don't allow yourself to be trapped in the past. While Ganondorf suggests that the people of the Great Sea don't really have anything to live for, and he desires to return to the old glory days of Hyrule, the game's developers suggest that Ganondorf's rose-tinted glasses are his ultimate downfall. Hyrule is gone, and he's trying to create something that he cannot bring back. Meanwhile, the king, who recognizes that grasping onto hope for the return of the hero of time had failed his people, decides to let go of his kingdom and his royal title, and his life, once and for all. "I have lived regretting the past," he says mournfully at the end of the game. "But you, I want you to live for the future." Rather than having the people of the scattered islands across the Great Sea live in Hyrule's shadow forever, he chooses to let them start anew. We'll analyze how Eiji Aonuma, who's the head director for the Zelda games, lets all of these thematic ideas develop naturally throughout the game. In drawing upon several ideas from literary educator Thomas C. Foster's How to Read Literature Like a Professor, we can understand the hidden meanings, intentional or unintentional, behind the Wind Waker's design. The first unignorable element of the Wind Waker's world is its water. Sure, Game Informer tells me that the Great Sea was designed the way it is, so that the developers could give the impression of having a large world without needing the Nintendo GameCube to render all of it visually at once. But thematically speaking, the Great Flood has more than a few parallels to the story of Noah's Ark in the Book of Genesis. Divine powers, seeing the rampant evil in the world, choose to drown it in water, and the few survivors must rebuild society on their own. From here, as you travel as Link from island to island, meeting friends and allies of all sorts of different species, the next easy parallel to develop is that Link is Nintendo's equivalent of Noah. Of course, there are plenty of imperfections in this analogy. For example, in Hyrule, the water never goes away, and the crisis is only resolved by having it drown the kingdom even harder. But if we think about it in this sense, that the Christian god's evil and violence that he wants to end, and Ganondorf's reign of terror are comparable, then it seems clear that Hyrule is forever tainted by malevolence. Its continued existence, even if it's in a preserved state, is a symbol of ruin. The idea of water also ties neatly into Link's own hero's quest. In How to Read Literature Like a Professor, Thomas Foster impresses upon us, as blossoming literary analysis, that the stated reason for a quest is never the actual reason. It makes sense then that Link, who supposedly leaves his home to try and rescue his sister, ends up embarking on a far grander journey, one that continues even after he saves her and brings her home, a little more than halfway throughout the journey. This is represented symbolically by a super important cutscene. After he botches his first rescue mission, he gets thrown into the water by the Helmrock King, and importantly, lands with a splash. While you as a player are free to jump into the water and drown yourself as often as you like from the beginning of the game, this represents the first time you actually land in the water forcefully as part of the game's story. This is the symbolic baptism of Link into something more than just a 12-year-old in someone else's clothing. He becomes a reincarnation of the hero of time, destined to save the world. And even if I, as a Zelda nerd, have witnessed Link in so many different reincarnations from generation to generation and game to game, take on the task of saving the world from Ganondorf, for the character Link that exists for the first time in the Wind Waker, this is a sudden realization, and in a sense, the true quest that Link embarks on as one of saving the people around him. There's also some religious imagery associated with the person, thing, vehicle that he wakes up next to, the King of Red Lions. This sensible and sage-talking bout meets a lot of the criteria for a Christ figure. While he's way older than Jesus, he spends a lot of time in solitude, he can sort of go fishing, he can walk on water if literally being a boat counts as walking, he works closely with Tetra and Link, who are both children, and, of course, he ultimately sacrifices himself in order to redeem an unworthy world by drowning himself alongside his kingdom. King Hyrule can also be seen as an example of standing too close to the hero. After all, the boat is Link's greatest ally and partner throughout the game. But his Christ imagery is meant to emphasize the scale of his sacrifice. As the entirety of Hyrule drowns, a baptism is occurring on an institutional level, and whatever washes afloat, namely Link, Zelda, and all the people they've met throughout the story, will serve as the foundation for a future society. Of course, no discussion about the Wind Waker would be complete without actually talking about the wind itself. As an ancient Chinese proverb goes, when the winds of change blow, some build walls while others build windmills. As Ganondorf suggests, the wind can only be called fate. Larger societal forces are what control the winds. And as Foster tells us, the weather and seasons can often illuminate larger ideas. Here they seem to suggest that resistance to the winds of change is inherently useless. Of course, as in any good story, the villain always has complexity. Ganondorf tells his own story of how the winds and the fates wronged him, describing how a burning wind punished his lands, and a frigid gale pierced his homes. No matter when it came, the wind always carried the same thing: death. Here, even as he stands in front of us, the protagonist, with two giant swords, we feel sympathy for Ganondorf. Fate disfavored him, and he grew bitter, especially as the winds that blew across the green fields of Hyrule served as something in the distance for him to try and yearn for. He spits on the idea of finding joy living in the Great Sea, calling its inhabitants pathetic creatures, drifting on the sea like fallen leaves on a forgotten pool. But this Ganondorf is the same one that appeared in the Ocarina of Time, and the winds of change that once brought the hero of time to defeat Ganondorf now demand that Hyrule can never be brought back to life, no matter how hard he wishes for it. Only in death does he recognize this unfortunate reality. The wind, it is blowing, he says, as Link stabs the Master Sword into him. Sailing against the wind and trying to resist fate has kept him trapped in the past, and ultimately leads to his demise. The only character, it seems, who can master fate is Link himself. The Wind Waker is actually a baton that allows him to redirect the wind's direction and warp himself across the Great Sea with ease. Link is all-powerful, and it's almost as if the game wants us to believe that he's a divine figure, even though Noah, while being treated as favored by God, isn't exactly Jesus. But just as the hero of time is treated as a deity, with everyone praying for his return, and a custom of dressing children up in his clothes like a ritual, Link seems destined to follow that same path, to be the next hero of time, and to fill the shoes of the legend that never returned. In that sense, the Wind Waker raises its own questions of free will. Was there ever a world in which Link didn't assume the green clothing of the hero of time, which, as the game notes, is way too warm for the ocean environment he lives in? Is there any world in which he didn't eventually get the Master Sword and take on Ganondorf? Does he live for himself by his own choices, or is he doomed to serve as a hero forever? As an article published by AV Club notes, the end of the Wind Waker feels a lot like the end of the Ocarina of Time, with Link and Ganondorf set to battle once again, and Zelda, once disguised, coming to Link's aid. But, in the end, tying this idea of finally letting go of the past Link breaks the cycle that would make the Wind Waker a repetition of someone else's legend. He wishes not to be like Jesus, serving as a savior, but more like Noah, an ordinary person who merely did what divine forces asked of him. He wants his future to be written by himself, not by the hero of time. And that's why, after he kills Ganondorf, he leaves the Master Sword behind, permanently embedded in his enemy's head. After you beat the game for the first time, you're given the option to play again, but this time wearing your pajamas, the clothes you were wearing at the beginning of the game, rather than the ones you were forced into against your will to make you someone that you weren't. As the game finally comes to a close, and Tetra, who again has abandoned the guise of being Princess Zelda to be who she wants to be, joins Link and the other pirates to set sail in order to discover their own new kingdom. Link gives up control of the wind. He isn't in charge anymore, and he doesn't try to use the Wind Waker to control anything. Instead, as Tetra puts it, as for our destination, the wind will guide us. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy. Thank you so much for watching this video. It was a complete amateur production, my first time ever trying to create content like this or use video editing software, and I'm looking for ways I can try and do better in the future. So if there are things you noticed while you were watching, or if you have any advice to give for how I can improve, I'd love to hear it. Thanks again, and take care.